before the imposition of the blockade, we were seeing 600 trucks come in daily. After the blockade was put in place, that went to 0 until mid-May. And then they started allowing about 100 trucks in. Gaza is receiving about 1/6 of what it needs to sustain the population.
I don't think politicians really recognize to any degree at all the long-term damage that is inflicted by famine and famine under a state of stress. So I think it doesn't get taken into account, and therefore the responses tend to be weak. There's not an urgency. I think as scientists, we see the images that you've been talking about, and we can understand what this means for the future as well as what's happening now. But I'm not sure the politicians actually have a real understanding of the health costs that have been buried in bodies that are going to come back to the surface and adversely impact health across the life course into the next generation. And it's not just health, it's human capital, it's cognitive function, it's the capacity to succeed in education. It's so many different aspects of just being human that are being damaged in this setting.
I'm really very, very concerned. Even if the famine in Gaza would stop today, it still has long-term consequences. Still, the youngest generation will have consequences in terms of their physical and mental health and their behavior for the rest of their lives.
That was Jonathan Wells, Professor of Anthropology and Paediatric Nutrition at the University College London, and Tessa Roseboom, Professor of Early Development and Health at the University of Amsterdam. In August, famine was officially declared in Gaza after months of aid being blocked from entering the Strip by Israel. At least 370 people, including 133 children, have so far died from acute hunger, and there appears to be no end in sight. The consequences of the Israeli-induced famine in Gaza are profound, and we have very clear evidence on the impact of starvation on an individual's development. Starvation has happened in a number of settings in the past. Leningrad and Netherlands during the Second World War are notable examples. Scientists have studied the people who suffered during these famines and have tracked the impact across generations.
And the first thing that happens with malnutrition is that we don't have enough energy for all of those functions. And the one that's prioritized is simply survival, defense. But the problem is that that defense comes at a cost to health. So infants have high requirements for protein as well as energy, and they are going through in normal development of the process of continuing to construct the vital organs, the heart, the liver, the kidney, the pancreas, and so on, as well as muscle tissue. And if we have deficits to nutrition in that period, even if we give better nutrition later on, we can't recover what was missed during those critical periods. We call them critical windows. It's a process of rapid cell division, and that cell division is helping, if you like, build the architecture of organs like the heart and the lungs and the pancreas and so on. And if we miss that window, we can't really recover the full benefits later on.
The reality is there just isn't enough food being allowed into Gaza, and as a result, children are suffering. Chris McIntosh is the Humanitarian Response Advisor for the charity Oxfam. Here he is explaining the nutritional logistics of what's needed.
Aid and food needs to be allowed to enter unfettered at the rates that we saw pre-blockade. So that's upwards of 600 trucks, more or less, every day. And Gaza is not seeing not even half of that. The problem is that it's not enough in quantity, and it's not enough in nutritional value. What should happen is there should be medical grade nutrition that's introduced into their diet to get them healthy enough that they can start having other food. So yeah, indeed. And right now the market is flooded with all sorts of starches and carbohydrates. So you have pasta, you have rice, you have bread everywhere you want it almost, but that's not nutritional, and that's not going to bring someone back, especially not a child, from acute malnutrition. So it's these details that really matter. It's that nuance, and it's far more complicated than yes, some items are getting into Gaza.
And it's not only about getting nutritious food into Gaza. The population has to be well fed enough to be able to access that food. Marie McGrath is the former head of the Emergency Nutrition Network. She has a huge amount of experience in this area. Here she is explaining.
When we think of food aid, and there's been a lot of talk of food aid and food drops, etc., that's the tip of the iceberg. When you see a very thin child, and you concentrate on the weight, and you see the weight, and they must gain weight. And it's such a crude indicator of malnutrition. Beneath that surface, there's going to be micronutrient deficiencies, metabolic changes, etc. And so as people talk about getting access to food, it is access to so much more than that. And it's overwhelming, the thought of what is needed. And for those who are looking to gain access, I think this is no news to those who are in the front line and responding, but it really needs to be an awareness amongst the funders and the responders who are supporting that response, that the level of intervention and resource and capacity and the devastation that will be faced once there is access.
We know that starvation in childhood can impact a person throughout the rest of their lives, but the impacts can also be seen for generations. Tessa Roseboom has studied the impact of a famine in the Netherlands caused by the Nazi regime withholding food during the Second World War, and the impact this has had on subsequent generations.
Our lives don't start at fertilization, but the egg that made me was actually made when my mother was in my grandmother's womb, just like for everyone else. And for me, that happens to be exactly during the Dutch famine. So my grandmother was pregnant with my mum when the famine started, and that must have been around the time that in her ovaries the eggs were formed. The genetic code itself doesn't change, but there is a large body of scientific evidence, both from studies in the Dutch hunger winter as well as in other famine situations, that lack of food actually leaves epigenetic marks on the genome, which contribute to, and we know that also for the Dutch famine, that those exposed to famine prenatally were epigenetically altered by the lack of food, which then impacted their metabolism, which impacted the stress sensitivity, and that was transmitted to the next generation. And an example I often give to students is that many people know that folic acid is advised to pregnant women in order to prevent neural tube defects. And we know that folic acid is a very potent methyl donor, so it donates methyl groups to the DNA, which are actually the switches on the genes to either activate them or deactivate them. So in a very similar way, lack of nutrition alters the switches on the genome, which switch on, for instance, genes that code for stress receptors, increasing stress sensitivity, and thereby increasing individuals' responsiveness to stress, exactly as we've seen in babies who were conceived during the famine in a very stressful time. So with lots of daily life stressors, their blood pressures rise much more extremely, and that increases their risk of cardiovascular disease, which is also what we found in the Dutch famine. Men and women exposed to famine prenatally have more cardiovascular disease and actually increased cardiovascular mortality.
It's clear that the effects of malnutrition and starvation will persist in Gaza for decades. Fast and sustained nutritional aid is needed urgently. Chris McIntosh from Oxfam gives us the final account, for now, of this man-made catastrophe.
Some months ago, it was mainly in a wait and see. We were in a wait and see mode, more of trying to identify where this is going, how many supplies in reserve we had, and that other people had, in order to pull through, hoping that the blockade would be lifted. And now that bubble has burst, so to speak. There are no reserve stocks anymore. There's whatever people can find in the market, and obviously the big difference is people are acutely malnourished. People are starving. Whereas before we still were managing somewhat, but now it's gotten to endemic levels. There's nobody that's not affected by what's happening on the ground in Gaza.
To read our ongoing coverage of the crisis in Gaza, please visit bmj.com.